I never imagined I'd be the one to lose everything while barely conscious, my own hand forced to betray me. They told me the sedation would make me feel nothing. Instead, it numbed my heart as they forced that pen into my trembling fingers. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Marjorie Whitmore, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought I understood love. I thought the brownstone apartment in Brooklyn Heights where I'd lived for 47 years would always be mine. I thought my children would protect me as I had protected them. I was wrong about everything. The morning it all started, I remember the smell of Earl Grey tea steaming in my favorite china cup, the one with tiny blue roses that my late husband Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. I was sitting in my leather armchair by the window, watching the early commuters hurry past on Montague Street below. The autumn leaves were turning golden on the old oak tree across the street, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone rang. "Mom, we need to talk." It was my son David, his voice carrying that strained tone I'd grown to dread. "Can we come over today?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, though something cold settled in my stomach. "Is everything all right?" "We'll explain when we get there." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling suddenly small in my own home. Through the window I could see the Brooklyn Bridge stretching toward Manhattan, its cables gleaming in the morning sun. I'd watched that bridge every day for decades, a constant in a world that seemed to shift beneath my feet more and more often. I should have known something was wrong when both David and his sister Patricia arrived together. They hadn't spoken to each other in months before that day, their relationship fractured by money and pride and all the small cruelties that families inflict on each other. But there they were, standing in my doorway like a united front, their faces wearing expressions I couldn't quite read. "Sit down, Mom," Patricia said, her voice gentler than it had been in years. "We need to discuss your future." Your future. Not our future together. Not how they could help me. My future. As if it belonged to them to decide. I settled back into my armchair, pulling my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The apartment suddenly felt too big, too quiet, filled with the weight of unspoken words. David sat on the couch where Robert used to read his newspapers, while Patricia perched on the edge of the dining room chair, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like armor. "Mom, you're getting older," David began, his tone carefully measured. "Living alone in this big place isn't safe anymore." "I manage just fine," I replied, though my voice sounded smaller than I intended. "Do you?" Patricia interjected. "You fell last month, remember? What if something serious happened and no one found you for days?" The fall. I'd slipped in the bathroom. Nothing serious, just a bruise on my hip. But somehow they'd found out, probably from Mrs. Chen next door, who meant well but worried too much. I'd been handling my own life for 7 decades, but suddenly everyone thought I was helpless. "We've found a wonderful assisted living facility," David continued. "Sunset Manor, out in Queens. They have activities, medical care on site, people your own age to socialize with. People my own age. As if being 73 meant I belonged in some separate category of humanity, tucked away where I wouldn't be an inconvenience to anyone. "I don't want to move," I said quietly. "This is my home." Patricia sighed, the sound sharp with impatience. "Mom, be realistic. You can't maintain this place anymore. The property taxes alone are eating up your savings." "My savings?" How did she know about my savings? "And frankly," David added, "the equity in this apartment could fund your care for years. It's worth over $1 million now. We could sell it, put you somewhere comfortable, and invest the rest to ensure you're taken care of." There it was, the real reason for their sudden concern. my Brooklyn Heights brownstone apartment. Purchased for $30,000 in 1976, was now worth more than I'd ever imagined. Prime real estate in one of New York's most desirable neighborhoods. My husband and I had scrimped and saved to buy this place, had raised our children here, had built a life within these walls. Now it was just an asset to be liquidated. "I need time to think," I said, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my teacup. "Of course, Mom," Patricia said, her voice honey-sweet. "But don't take too long. The facility has a waiting list, and we don't want you to miss out on such a perfect opportunity." They left me sitting in that chair, staring out at the bridge, wondering when I had become someone whose opinion didn't matter in decisions about my own life. The tea had gone cold in my cup, and the apartment felt cavernous around me, filled with 47 years of memories that apparently meant nothing to anyone but me. I thought about Robert then, about how he used to call me his Iron Lady because I never backed down from a fight. He'd laughed when I'd argued with the landlord about broken heating, when I'd marched down to the school to defend our children, when I'd stood up to his boss who tried to shortchange his pension. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped fighting. I'd become compliant, agreeable, the kind of mother who said yes to everything and asked for nothing in return. That night, I called my granddaughter Emma. She was David's daughter, 25 and working as a graphic designer in Manhattan. Of all my family, she was the only one who still called just to chat, who remembered my birthday without prompting, who seemed to see me as more than just an aging burden. "Gran!" Her voice was bright with genuine pleasure. "How are you doing?" I paused, not sure how to put it into words. "I'm confused, sweetheart." "About what?" I told her about the visit, about the assisted living facility, about the way David and Patricia had presented it, as if my opinion was merely a formality. Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Gran, do you want to move?" Such a simple question, but no one else had bothered to ask it. "No," I whispered. "I love my home." "Then don't move. But they think it's best for me." "They think it's best for them," Emma said firmly. "There's a difference." After we hung up, I walked through my apartment, really looking at it for the first time in months. The kitchen where I'd taught my children to cook, where Robert and I had shared countless cups of coffee and quiet conversations. The living room where we'd hosted birthday parties and holiday dinners, where I'd rocked my grandchildren to sleep. The bedroom where Robert had died peacefully in his sleep 3 years ago, where I'd grieved and slowly learned to live alone. This wasn't just real estate. This was my life, contained within 4 walls and 47 years of love and loss and daily existence. But even as I felt a spark of defiance, doubt crept in. Was I being selfish? Were David and Patricia right that I couldn't manage on my own anymore? The questions swirled in my mind like autumn leaves caught in a wind, impossible to catch and examine properly. The next morning brought another phone call from David. "Mom, I've made an appointment for you to tour Sunset Manor on Thursday. Patricia and I will pick you up at 10. "I haven't decided anything yet," I protested. "Just look at it. What could it hurt?" What could it hurt? Everything, I wanted to say. It could hurt everything if I started down this path and found myself swept along by other people's certainty about what was best for my life. But I said yes anyway, because that's what I always did. Sunset Manor was exactly what you'd expect. Beige carpets, fluorescent lighting, and the smell of industrial disinfectant barely masking something more unpleasant underneath. The director, a woman who couldn't have been more than 40, spoke about me as if I weren't there. "Mrs. Whitmore would fit right in here," she told David and Patricia. "We have wonderful programs for residents at her level of functioning." My level of functioning. I wanted to tell her that I'd been functioning just fine for 73 years, thank you very much. That I still read 3 newspapers every morning, still balanced my own checkbook, Still cooked elaborate meals for one because I refused to give up the simple pleasure of good food. Instead, I nodded and smiled and let them discuss my future, as if I were a child who needed adults to make the important decisions. The tour included a small apartment. They called it a suite, but it was really just a bedroom with a kitchenette that couldn't accommodate more than a hot plate. The window looked out onto a parking lot. There was no space for my piano, the baby grand that Robert had surprised me with for our 25th anniversary. There was no room for my books, my photographs, my garden of houseplants that had taken decades to cultivate. "It's perfect for you, Mom," Patricia said brightly. "So much less to worry about. Less to worry about, less to care for, less to love, less life to live." On the drive back to Brooklyn, David casually mentioned that he'd already spoken to a real estate agent. "Just to get an idea of market value," he said. "We want to make sure you get the best possible price." The best possible price for the life I'd built. As if love and memory could be converted into dollars and cents, deposited into some investment account to generate dividends for my final years. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, trying to make sense of my finances. I wasn't wealthy, not by any means, but I wasn't destitute either. My monthly pension from the school district where I'd worked as a librarian for 30 years, combined with Social Security and Robert's modest life insurance policy, was enough to cover my expenses. I owned my apartment outright. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. So why were my children so insistent that I couldn't afford to stay? I thought about calling Emma again, but it was late, and I didn't want to burden her with my problems. Instead, I found myself dialing the number for my old friend Rosa Martinez, who lived 2 buildings over on Remsen Street. Rosa had been my closest friend since 1985, when her family moved to the neighborhood. We'd raised our children together, had weathered decades of joys and sorrows side by side. If anyone would give me honest advice, it would be Rosa. "Mia," she said after I'd explained the situation, "this doesn't sound right to me. You think I'm being stubborn? I think you're being pressured. And I think you need to ask yourself why your children are so eager to get their hands on your apartment." The question hung in the air between us, uncomfortable and necessary. "Maybe they really do think it's best for me," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Maybe. Or maybe they see dollar signs and they're tired of waiting for their inheritance. The possibility hit me like a physical blow. Could my own children really be that calculating? Could their concern for my welfare be nothing more than a cover for their desire to claim what they saw as rightfully theirs? "Rosa," I said quietly, "what kind of mother am I if I even think such things about my own children?" "You're a mother who's finally waking up to reality," she replied. "And it's about time." After we hung up, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through my apartment in my nightgown, touching familiar objects as if they were talismans that could keep me grounded in my own life. The antique mirror that had belonged to my grandmother. The ceramic vase that Robert and I had bought on our honeymoon. The framed photograph of all of us at Emma's college graduation. The last time we'd all been genuinely happy together. When had it changed? When had my children stopped seeing me as their mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to overcome? I thought back to the years after Robert died, how David and Patricia had swooped in with offers of help that gradually became demands for control. They'd insisted on taking over my finances, just to make things easier. They'd criticized my housekeeping, my driving, my social activities. Every aspect of my independence had been slowly eroded, like a beach worn away by relentless waves. And I'd let it happen because I was grateful for their attention, desperate not to be forgotten or abandoned in my grief. The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. I was having breakfast when someone knocked on my door. Through the peephole, I saw a young man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm James Crawford from Crawford and Associates Real Estate. Your son David asked me to stop by to discuss listing your property." I hadn't agreed to list anything, But there he was on my doorstep, as if the decision had already been made. He walked through my home with the calculating eye of someone appraising livestock, making notes on his tablet, taking photographs. "Beautiful original hardwood floors," he murmured. "Classic pre-war details. This will sell quickly in today's market." He quoted a figure that made my head spin: $1.4 million. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But as he spoke about square footage and comparable sales and market trends, all I could think about was how he saw my life as nothing more than a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. After he left, I called David. "Why was there a real estate agent at my apartment?" I asked without preamble. "Mom, I told you we're just exploring options. Knowledge is power, right? You didn't have my permission to send him here." "I'm trying to help you make an informed decision. Isn't that what you want?" The conversation went in circles, with David painting himself as the devoted son trying to protect his confused mother from making poor choices. By the time I hung up, I felt dizzy and uncertain, as if my own reality was being rewritten by people who claimed to know better than I did what was good for me. That afternoon, Emma called. "Gran," Dad called me. "He says you're being difficult about the move." Difficult. The word stung. I'd been called many things in my life, stubborn, maybe, or opinionated, but never difficult. That was a word people used to describe inconvenient elderly relatives who didn't have the good grace to comply quietly with other people's plans for their lives. "I just want to stay in my own home," I said. "Then stay. You don't need anyone's permission to live your own life." If only it were that simple. The pressure from David and Patricia was constant now, a steady stream of phone calls and visits and helpful suggestions that felt more like commands. They'd scheduled another tour at a different assisted living facility. They'd made an appointment for me with a financial advisor who would help me understand my options. They'd even gone so far as to suggest that I might be developing dementia, that my reluctance to move was a sign of cognitive decline rather than a rational choice made by an adult woman. The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. They questioned my memory of conversations we'd had, suggested that I was forgetting things, hinted that I wasn't thinking clearly. It was an insidious form of emotional manipulation that made me doubt my own perceptions and judgment. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I felt a flicker of my old fighting spirit. I thought about Rosa's words, about Emma's fierce loyalty, about the woman I used to be before grief and loneliness made me compliant. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in November. I was feeling unwell, just a lingering cold that had settled in my chest, when David arrived unannounced with a woman I didn't recognize. "Mom, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I asked her to stop by and check on you." Dr. Mitchell was pleasant enough, but something about the situation felt wrong. Why hadn't David told me she was coming? Why hadn't he asked if I wanted to see a doctor? She examined me briefly, asked a few questions about how I'd been feeling, then had a whispered conversation with David in the hallway. When they returned, both of them looked grave. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Mitchell said, "I think you might benefit from a mild sedative to help with your anxiety about the move. It's completely natural to feel stressed about big life changes, but we don't want you to make yourself sicker with worry." I hadn't mentioned feeling anxious about any move. In fact, I'd barely spoken to her at all. But before I could object, she was preparing a syringe. "This will just help you relax," she said. "It's very mild, nothing to worry about." The injection made me feel drowsy and disconnected, as if I were floating slightly outside my own body. David helped me to my chair, brought me a glass of water, spoke to me in soothing tones about how everything would be all right. Then Patricia arrived with more papers to sign. "Just some preliminary documents," she explained, placing them on the coffee table in front of me. "Nothing major, just getting the process started." Through the fog of sedation, I tried to focus on the words, but the letters seemed to swim on the page. Legal language, property transfers, power of attorney forms. David placed a pen in my hand, guided my fingers to the signature line. "Just sign here, Mom. We'll take care of everything." My hand felt heavy, disconnected from my will. The pen moved across the paper, but something deep in my sedated consciousness rebelled against what was happening. This wasn't right. This wasn't what I wanted. This wasn't consent. It was coercion disguised as care. With tremendous effort, I fought through the chemical haze and focused on what I was writing. Instead of my name, instead of Marjorie Whitmore, I wrote one word with shaky but deliberate letters: not. Patricia glanced at the paper and nodded absently, then did a double take. Her face went white as she stared at my signature. "David," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Look at this." He leaned over her shoulder, and I watched his expression change from satisfaction to shock to something that looked almost like fear. "What is this?" he demanded, waving the paper in front of my face. "What did you write?" Through the sedation, I managed to speak. Not my name, not my choice, not happening. They tried to get me to sign again, claiming I'd made a mistake, that the medication had confused me. But despite feeling like I was underwater, I held on to that single word like a lifeline. Not. Not to their manipulation. Not to their theft disguised as care. Not to signing away my life while barely conscious. Dr. Mitchell gave me another injection, stronger this time, and I drifted into a heavy sleep filled with troubled dreams about faceless people taking pieces of my life away while I watched helplessly. I woke up the next morning alone in my apartment, fully clothed in the same chair where I'd been sedated. My head felt like it was filled with cotton, and my mouth was dry as dust. On the coffee table sat a stack of papers, some signed, some crumpled, and one with my defiant "not" still clearly visible where my signature should have been. It took several minutes for the full horror of what had happened to sink in. My own children had drugged me. They'd brought a doctor to my home under false pretenses, had her sedate me without my informed consent, and then tried to trick me into signing legal documents while I was impaired. This wasn't care. This wasn't love. This was elder abuse, plain and simple. But even as anger joined the confusion in my sedated brain, I felt something else stirring. A fierce determination that had been dormant for too long. They'd underestimated me. They thought I was just a confused old woman who could be manipulated and controlled. They hadn't counted on the fighter I used to be, the woman who'd stood up to landlords and school boards and anyone else who tried to push me around. That woman was still in there, buried under years of grief and compliance. But not dead. Not yet. I spent the rest of that day going through the papers they'd left behind, trying to understand what I'd been tricked into signing. Most of it was incomprehensible legal jargon. But one document was crystal clear. A power of attorney form that would give David complete control over my finances and medical decisions. Thank God for that one word, "not," scrawled on the signature line. It had invalidated the entire document, made it worthless. My moment of defiance, even through their chemical haze, had saved me from complete legal helplessness. But the discovery of what they'd attempted shook me to my core. These were my children, the babies I'd nursed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being. How had we gotten to this point where they saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between them and their inheritance? I thought about the years I'd devoted to them, the sacrifices I'd made. When David's first business failed, Robert and I had given him $10,000, our entire vacation savings. When Patricia went through her bitter divorce, I'd taken care of her children for months while she got back on her feet. When David's wife left him, I'd been there with home-cooked meals and babysitting and a shoulder to cry on. I'd been more than a mother. I'd been a bank, a caregiver, a therapist, a safety net they could fall back on whenever life got difficult. And this was how they repaid me? By drugging me and trying to steal my home? The phone rang constantly that day. David, Patricia, even the real estate agent wanting to know when he could show the apartment. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea with hands that shook only slightly, and sat in my chair by the window and began to plan. The first thing I did was call Emma. "Gran, you sound strange. Is everything okay?" I told her everything, about the fake doctor, the sedation, the attempted signature fraud. Emma was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Jesus Christ, Gran. That's not caregiving. That's kidnapping and fraud. You could have them arrested." The thought hadn't occurred to me, but Emma was right. What they'd done was criminal, not just immoral. But the idea of having my own children arrested felt impossible, even after everything they'd done. "What should I do?" I asked. "First, you need to get those papers to a lawyer. Real lawyer, not some friend of Dad's. Someone who represents your interests, not theirs." It was sound advice, but the thought of fighting my own family in court was exhausting before I even started. Was this what my life had come to? Legal battles with the people who should have been protecting me? Emma must have sensed my hesitation. "Gran, you don't have to burn your whole life down, but you do have to protect yourself." That evening, Rosa came over with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. She took one look at my face and wrapped me in a fierce hug that reminded me what unconditional love actually felt like. "Tell me," she said simply. I did. Rosa listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing increasingly angry as I described the events of the previous day. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, sipping her wine and staring out the window at the Brooklyn Bridge. "Mija," she finally said, "I've known you for almost 40 years. You raised those children with more love and sacrifice than any mother I've ever seen. But love doesn't give them the right to steal your life. They think they're helping me. They think they're helping themselves to your apartment." It was harsh, but probably true. Rosa had a gift for cutting through the emotional complexity of family relationships and seeing the simple, often ugly reality underneath. "What would you do?" I asked. "I'd fight," she said without hesitation. "I'd fight like hell." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that word, "not," and what it represented. It was the first time in years that I'd said no to my children, even if I'd been drugged when I did it. But the power of that refusal was intoxicating. I'd forgotten what it felt like to assert my own will, to refuse to be steamrolled by other people's plans for my life. The next morning brought another unwelcome visitor, Patricia, looking perfectly put together in her corporate power suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Mom, we need to talk about yesterday." "Yes," I agreed. "We do." She settled herself on the couch with the air of someone taking charge of a difficult but manageable situation. "I know you're confused about what happened, but—" "I'm not confused," I interrupted. "You drugged me and tried to trick me into signing away my rights while I was incapacitated." Patricia's carefully composed expression slipped slightly. "That's not. You're misremembering." "Am I? Because I have the papers you left behind, with my signature that very clearly says, 'not,' instead of my name. That doesn't sound like the behavior of a confused woman to me." "Mom, you're being melodramatic. Dr. Mitchell gave you something mild to help with your anxiety." "What anxiety? I never said I was anxious. And who is Dr. Mitchell? I've never seen her before in my life." Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a fresh set of papers. "Look, let's just move past this and focus on what's important. We have a new set of documents here that properly reflect—" "No." The word came out stronger than I'd intended, surprising us both. Patricia's eyes widened slightly. "Mom—" "No," I repeated, standing up from my chair with more confidence than I'd felt in months. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not moving anywhere. And I'm certainly not conducting any more business while drugged by some fake doctor you hired to make me compliant." "She's not fake. She's a perfectly legitimate—" "Then why didn't she examine me properly?" Why didn't she ask about my medical history or current medications? Why did she sedate me based on anxiety symptoms that only existed in David's imagination? Patricia was flustered now, her careful control slipping as she reached for legal-sounding arguments that fell apart under basic scrutiny. Watching her scramble for justifications was almost satisfying, if it weren't so sad to see what my daughter had become. The bottom line is this, I continued, feeling stronger with every word. This is my home, my life, and my decision. If you can't respect that, then perhaps we don't have anything else to discuss. Patricia stood up abruptly, shoving the papers back into her briefcase with sharp, angry movements. Fine. But don't come crying to us when you fall down the stairs or have a stroke and lie there for days before anyone finds you. If that's your greatest fear, maybe you should call me more often. You know, like a daughter who actually cares about her mother's well-being. She left without another word, slamming my door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. I stood there in the sudden silence, my heart pounding with adrenaline, and something that felt remarkably like triumph. I'd done it. I'd said no. I'd stood up for myself against my own daughter's manipulation and emotional blackmail. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, but I knew this was just the beginning. David and Patricia weren't going to give up easily. There was too much money at stake. They'd regroup, find new angles of attack, new ways to undermine my confidence and autonomy. I had to be ready for them. That afternoon, I made appointments with a lawyer and a new doctor, both of them recommended by Emma, both of them with no connection to my family. I was done taking other people's word for what was best for me. From now on, I was going to get independent advice from people who had no financial stake in the outcome. The lawyer, Margaret Chen, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law. Her office was in downtown Brooklyn, close enough to walk to when the weather was nice. She listened to my story with increasing concern, making notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline of events. What they did constitutes elder abuse, she said bluntly when I finished. The sedation without informed consent, the attempt to obtain signatures while you were impaired, these are serious crimes, not just ethical violations. I don't want to have them arrested, I said quickly. I understand, but you do need to protect yourself from future attempts. We should start with a comprehensive evaluation of your legal and financial situation. Make sure there aren't other vulnerabilities they might try to exploit. She walked me through the process of revoking any powers of attorney I might have previously signed, securing my financial accounts, and documenting the attempted fraud for future reference. It was exhausting work, but also empowering. For the first time in months, I felt like I had an advocate on my side. The new doctor, Dr. Elizabeth Torres, was equally professional and reassuring. She conducted a thorough physical exam, the kind I should have received from the mysterious Dr. Mitchell, and pronounced me in excellent health for a woman my age. Your blood pressure is a little elevated, but that's hardly surprising given what you've been dealing with, she said. There are absolutely no medical reasons why you couldn't continue living independently for many years to come. Having that official medical opinion was like having armor against my children's claims that I was declining or confused or unable to care for myself. I was none of those things. I was just a woman who'd been systematically undermined by the people who should have been supporting her. Over the next few weeks, David and Patricia tried every trick in their playbook. They brought in other relatives, friends from church, even my old neighbors to convince me that moving was the sensible choice. Each conversation followed the same script, expressions of concern about my safety, hints about my mental capacity, suggestions that I was being stubborn and unreasonable. But now that I knew what to look for, their manipulation tactics were transparent. I could see the way they talked about me as if I weren't there, the way they dismissed my clearly stated preferences, the way they painted themselves as the long-suffering children trying to care for a difficult mother. The breakthrough came when David made a crucial mistake. He called Margaret Chen's office, claiming to be my son and requesting copies of my legal documents. Of course, Margaret couldn't release anything without my permission, but the fact that he'd tried told me everything I needed to know about his respect for my privacy and autonomy. "He's getting desperate," Margaret observed when she called to tell me about the contact. "That's actually good news. It means our defensive measures are working. But desperate people do unpredictable things, and I wasn't prepared for David's next move." I was grocery shopping at the little market on Court Street when I ran into Sarah Morrison, an old friend from the school where I'd worked. We chatted pleasantly for a few minutes, catching up on news about mutual acquaintances and our families. When I mentioned that I was still living in Brooklyn Heights, her face took on an expression of confusion. "But David told me you'd moved to one of those senior communities," she said. "He made it sound like you were much happier there, closer to medical care and all that." My blood ran cold. "When did he tell you that?" "Oh, just last week at the grocery store. He seemed so relieved that you'd finally agreed to make the move." I excused myself and walked home in a daze, my mind racing with the implications. David was telling people that I'd already moved, that the decision had been made and executed. Was he trying to create a narrative that would make my actual resistance seem irrational? Or was this preparation for something even worse? That evening, I called Emma. "Gran, that's really disturbing. It sounds like Dad is trying to create a false reality where you've already agreed to everything he wants." "But why?" "I don't know, but it can't be good. Maybe you should stay with Rosa for a few nights, just until we figure out what he's planning." I'd been thinking the same thing. My apartment no longer felt safe. Not when David had keys, and apparently no qualms about showing up with fake doctors to sedate me. Rosa immediately agreed to let me stay with her, and we made plans for me to come over the next evening with a small overnight bag. But I never made it to Rosa's apartment. The next morning, I woke up feeling dizzy and nauseous. At first, I thought it might be the flu. There had been a nasty bug going around the neighborhood. But as the morning progressed, I felt worse instead of better. By noon, I was so weak I could barely stand. I called Dr. Torres, who urged me to come in immediately. Rosa drove me to the clinic where blood tests revealed something shocking. I had been systematically poisoned with small doses of sleeping medication over several days. "Someone has been putting benzodiazepines in your food or drink," Dr. Torres said grimly. "Not enough to kill you, but enough to make you confused, compliant, and appear to be suffering from cognitive decline." The room spun around me as the full horror of the situation sank in. Someone had been drugging me. Not just the one time with the fake doctor, but repeatedly, methodically, in doses small enough to seem like normal aging or mild illness. "Who has access to your food?" Dr. Torres asked. The answer was obvious, though I didn't want to believe it. David had been bringing me groceries every few days, claiming he didn't want me to have to carry heavy bags. Patricia had been making me lunch during her visits, insisting that I needed to eat better. They'd been slowly poisoning me while expressing concern for my health and well-being. "We need to call the police," Rosa said firmly. "This has gone way beyond family drama. This is attempted murder." But even faced with that evidence, I hesitated. These were my children. However twisted their actions had become, they were still the babies I'd nursed through midnight fevers, the toddlers I'd taught to tie their shoes, the teenagers I'd worried about and prayed for and loved unconditionally. "I need time to think," I said weakly. Dr. Torres was not as sympathetic to my maternal instincts. "Mrs. Whitmore, if someone continues to poison you, you could suffer permanent neurological damage or even death. This isn't a matter of family reconciliation. It's a matter of survival." She was right, but the emotional weight of that reality was almost unbearable. How do you call the police on your own children? How do you admit that the people who should love you most in the world are willing to slowly kill you for money? Rosa took me back to her apartment, where I spent the afternoon in a fog of grief and disbelief. She made me strong coffee and kept me talking, helping me process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. "Mija, You have to stop thinking of them as your children, she said gently. Children don't try to murder their mothers for inheritance money. These are criminals who happen to share your DNA. That night, as I lay in Rose's guest bedroom, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called Detective Maria Santos at the 84th Precinct and made a formal complaint against David and Patricia for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted poisoning. The investigation moved quickly once the police got involved. They found the benzodiazepines in my coffee canister and sugar bowl, both containers that David had recently replaced, claiming that the old ones were getting stale. They interviewed the fake Dr. Mitchell, who turned out to be a nurse practitioner whose license had been suspended for unethical conduct. She'd been paid $500 cash to sedate me without conducting a proper examination or obtaining informed consent. Most damning of all was the paperwork trail Margaret Chen had helped me uncover. David and Patricia had been planning this for months, consulting with financial advisors about the best way to liquidate my assets, researching assisted living facilities that would accept emergency placements, even pre-selecting an apartment in Manhattan that they planned to purchase with the proceeds from selling my home. They'd calculated that the Brooklyn Heights property would net them approximately $900,000 after taxes and fees. The assisted living facility would cost about $60,000 per year, which meant I could be cared for 15 years while they enjoyed the remaining capital. It was a business plan for my disposal, complete with spreadsheets and cost-benefit analyses. The confrontation came on a cold December morning when Detective Santos arrested both David and Patricia at their respective homes. I wasn't there to witness it, but Emma called me afterward to describe her father's shock and her aunt's tears as they were led away in handcuffs. Dad kept saying it was all a misunderstanding, Emma told me, her voice heavy with disgust. That everything he did was to protect you. Even Aunt Patricia was claiming they were just trying to help. Help! The word had lost all meaning after everything they'd put me through. The legal proceedings took months, during which I lived quietly at Rosa's apartment while my own home was processed as a crime scene. Margaret Chen handled the criminal case with ruthless efficiency, building an ironclad argument that my children had engaged in a systematic campaign of elder abuse designed to facilitate the theft of my property. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged power of attorney documents, the fake medical evaluations, the systematic poisoning, the elaborate financial planning to dispose of my assets. When faced with potential prison sentences, both David and Patricia eventually pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and permanent restraining orders. The day I was finally able to return to my apartment was both triumphant and heartbreaking. The rooms were exactly as I'd left them, but they felt different, tainted by the knowledge of what had happened there. I spent hours just walking through the space, reclaiming it inch by inch, replacing everything my children might have contaminated. But gradually, the apartment began to feel like home again. I bought new furniture to replace pieces that held bad memories. I changed the locks and had a security system installed. Most importantly, I filled the space with new experiences and relationships that had nothing to do with David and Patricia. Emma came by regularly, bringing her new boyfriend and helping me redecorate. Rosa and I started hosting weekly dinners for other women from the neighborhood who lived alone. I joined a book club at the library, took a watercolor painting class, even started dating a gentle widower named Frank who lived a few blocks away. The transformation wasn't instant. Healing from that level of betrayal takes time. There were nights when I woke up crying, mourning not just the relationship I'd lost with my children, but the illusion that family meant safety and unconditional love. I had to learn to trust my own judgment again after months of being told I was confused and incompetent. But slowly, steadily, I built a new life based on my own choices rather than other people's expectations. I discovered that I actually enjoyed living alone, that solitude wasn't the terrifying prospect my children had made it out to be. I had friends who called because they wanted to talk to me, not because they needed something from me. I had activities that brought me joy rather than obligation. 6 months after the arrests, I received a letter from David. It was full of apologies and explanations, promises that he'd never meant for things to go so far, claims that he'd just been worried about my welfare. He asked if we could meet for coffee, talk things through, maybe start rebuilding our relationship. I read the letter twice, then put it in my shredder. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. Some relationships are too toxic to salvage. I'd spent 10 months of my life being systematically poisoned, manipulated, and defrauded by the two people who should have been protecting me. No amount of apologies could undo that violation of trust. Instead, I wrote him a letter of my own. Brief, clear, and final. I told him that I was grateful for the 25 good years we'd had before everything went wrong, but that those years didn't give him the right to steal the rest of my life. I told him that I wished him well, but that we were finished as a family. Patricia never reached out at all, which was probably for the best. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to Florida, whether to start fresh or to avoid the whispers and gossip in Brooklyn. I found that I didn't particularly care either way. The strangest part of the whole experience was discovering how much I'd been diminished by their care. For years, they'd been gradually eroding my confidence, undermining my judgment, making me doubt my ability to manage my own affairs. Once that constant criticism was removed from my life, I flourished in ways I hadn't expected. I learned to use online banking and started managing my own investments with the help of a fee-only financial advisor who had no incentive to steer me toward expensive products. I bought a smartphone and figured out how to video chat with Emma when she traveled for work. I even learned to drive in Manhattan again, something I'd avoided for years because David kept telling me it wasn't safe for someone my age. Every small victory was a revelation. I wasn't fading or failing. I'd been functioning under an artificial cloud of doubt and criticism that had nothing to do with my actual capabilities. Freed from that burden, I rediscovered the competent, confident woman I'd always been. The financial aspects of the case were resolved fairly quickly. The court ordered David and Patricia to pay full restitution for the costs of the investigation, my legal fees, and a substantial penalty for the elder abuse. More importantly, they were permanently barred from having any involvement in my financial or medical decisions. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was psychological. For the first time in years, I was living entirely on my own terms. No one was questioning my decisions, undermining my confidence, or treating me like an inconvenient child who needed to be managed. A year after the arrests, I decided to celebrate my newfound independence by taking a trip I'd dreamed about since Robert died, but never had the courage to plan alone. Emma helped me book a 2-week tour of Italy, complete with art museums, cooking classes, and wine tastings in Tuscany. The trip was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more. I made friends with other travelers, discovered that I had a talent for photography, and realized that being alone didn't mean being lonely. Every sunset over the Mediterranean was a reminder that life could still hold surprises and beauty, even at 74. When I returned to Brooklyn, I found a package waiting for me from David. Inside was a small ceramic bowl I'd admired years ago at a craft fair. He'd remembered that detail after all these years and had it custom-made by a pottery artist in Vermont. The accompanying note was simple. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope someday you can forgive me." I kept the bowl because it was beautiful, but I threw away the note unread. Some apologies come too late to matter, after too much damage has been done. Forgiveness isn't always possible or even desirable. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to simply move on. Emma graduated to become my closest family relationship, the bridge between the grandmother I'd always been and the independent woman I was becoming. She never pressured me to reconcile with her father or aunt, never made me feel guilty for the choices I'd made to protect myself. Instead, she celebrated my transformation and supported my new adventures. "Gran, you're like a completely different person," she told me over dinner at a new restaurant in Dumbo. "You seem so much happier, so much more yourself." She was right. I was more myself than I'd been since Robert died, maybe even more myself than I'd been during our marriage. For the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for my own satisfaction rather than trying to meet other people's expectations or needs. 2 years after the crisis, I made another major decision that would have been unthinkable during the years of family pressure. I decided to sell the Brooklyn Heights apartment after all, not because anyone was forcing me to, but because I wanted something different for the next chapter of my life. The apartment held too many painful memories now, and I found myself drawn to the idea of a fresh start somewhere new. With Margaret Chen's help, I sold the property for even more than the original appraisal, $1.7 million, and used the proceeds to buy a charming 2-bedroom condo in Hoboken, New Jersey, right across the river from Manhattan. The new place had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River and the Manhattan skyline. I could see the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance, a reminder of where I'd come from, but I was surrounded by new neighbors, new restaurants, new possibilities. At 76, I was starting over completely, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Rosa was initially skeptical about the move. She worried that I was running away from my problems rather than solving them. But when she visited the new condo and saw how happy I was, she understood that this was growth, not escape. "Mija, you look 10 years younger," she said as we sat on my new balcony, watching the ferries cross the river. "This place suits you." She was right. The person I'd become, independent, adventurous, confident in my own judgment, needed a living space that reflected those qualities. The Brooklyn Heights apartment had been perfect for the woman I was during my marriage, but it no longer fit the woman I'd chosen to become. Frank, the widower I'd been dating, was initially disappointed by my decision to move. We'd developed a comfortable routine of dinners and movies and long walks through Brooklyn Heights. But when I invited him to visit Hoboken, he was charmed by both the location and the clear evidence of my happiness there. "You know, Martha," he said one evening as we watched the sunset behind the Manhattan skyline, "I've never known anyone who reinvented herself so completely at our age. It's inspiring." Inspiring. That was a word I'd never associated with myself, but perhaps it was accurate. How many 76-year-old women completely rebuild their lives after discovering their children tried to poison them for inheritance money? How many learn to thrive alone after decades of defining themselves primarily in relation to other people? The legal aftermath of the case continued for several years, mostly in the form of civil suits related to the restitution payments. David and Patricia both struggled financially after the criminal penalties, and there were times when I almost felt sorry for them. But then I would remember the systematic way they'd undermined my health and autonomy, the calculating spreadsheets that treated my life as a business expense, and my sympathy would evaporate. Justice, I learned, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about preventing further harm and creating space for healing. The restraining orders meant I never had to see or speak to David and Patricia again unless I chose to. That legal protection was worth more than any financial settlement. On my 78th birthday, Emma threw me a surprise party at my Hoboken condo. The guest list was eclectic: Rosa and several of her children, Frank and his daughter, new friends from my watercolor class, neighbors from the building, even Margaret Chen and Dr. Torres, who had become genuine friends over the years. As I looked around the room filled with people who cared about me without wanting anything in return, I realized that I'd built something better than the family I'd lost. These were relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than blood obligation and financial entanglement. The evening's biggest surprise came when Emma stood up to make a toast. "To my grandmother," she said, raising her wine glass, "who taught me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to start over, and never too late to choose happiness over obligation." The room erupted in applause, but what moved me most was the look in Emma's eyes: pride, love, and something that looked like admiration. My granddaughter was proud of me, not for the sacrifices I'd made or the suffering I'd endured, but for the strength I'd found and the life I'd built. That night, after all the guests had gone home and I was alone in my condo, I stood on the balcony looking out at the lights of Manhattan. 3 years ago, I'd been a broken woman living in fear of her own children, doubting her sanity and her right to make decisions about her own life. Now I was a woman who'd fought back against systematic abuse and won. I was a woman who'd rebuilt her life entirely on her own terms. I was a woman who'd discovered that happiness wasn't something you waited for other people to give you. It was something you created for yourself through the choices you made every single day. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been dark nights when I'd questioned everything, when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when I'd wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake in cutting ties with David and Patricia. But each morning brought new proof that I'd made the right choice, that protecting myself had been an act of self-respect rather than self-destruction. I thought about that word I'd written instead of my signature while drugged and barely conscious. Not. It had been an instinctive refusal, a rejection of their attempt to erase my will and autonomy. But it had also been a declaration of independence, the first step toward reclaiming my own life. Not to their manipulation, not to their contempt disguised as care, not to signing away my future while they controlled my present, not to accepting less than I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. That single word had saved my life in more ways than one. It had prevented them from gaining legal control over my finances and medical decisions. But more importantly, it had reminded me that I still had the power to refuse, to resist, to insist on better treatment. The story could have ended so differently. If I'd been a little more compliant, a little more trusting, a little more willing to believe that my children knew better than I did what was good for me, I might have ended up in that beige assisted living facility, slowly declining while they enjoyed the proceeds from my home sale. Instead, I was standing on my own private balcony overlooking one of the most beautiful views in the world, financially secure and emotionally healthy, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the gift of choosing yourself over their expectations. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's worst impulses. Sometimes walking away from family is the only way to save your own life. I'd learned that love without respect is just manipulation with better marketing. I'd learned that blood relationships don't automatically entitle people to unlimited access to your resources or unlimited tolerance for their abuse. I'd learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's essential for maintaining your dignity and sanity. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to demand better treatment, never too late to build the life you actually want rather than the life other people think you should have. At 78, I was happier and more fulfilled than I'd been in decades. I had plans for the future, art classes in Tuscany next fall, maybe a pottery workshop in New Mexico after that. I had friends who called just to chat, hobbies that brought me joy, a living space that reflected my own taste rather than someone else's vision of what was appropriate for a woman my age. I had, most surprisingly of all, hope. Hope for new experiences, new relationships, new adventures. Hope that the best parts of my life might still be ahead of me rather than behind me. Hope that I could continue growing and changing and discovering new aspects of myself for however many years I had left. The story of my family's betrayal had become the story of my liberation. The plot to steal my independence had become the catalyst for claiming more autonomy than I'd ever imagined possible. The attempt to diminish me had resulted in my expansion into a bigger, more confident version of myself. That's what I want you to understand, if you've listened this far. If someone in your life is making you doubt your own judgment, undermining your confidence, or pressuring you to make major decisions based on their convenience rather than your preferences, you have the right to say no. You have the right to get second opinions. You have the right to take time to think. You have the right to choose yourself, even if it disappoints other people. You have the right to write "not" on any document that doesn't serve your best interests, literally or metaphorically. You have the right to refuse to sign away your autonomy, your dignity, or your future, no matter who's asking and no matter how they frame the request. Most of all, you have the right to build a life that makes you happy rather than a life that makes other people comfortable. You have the right to prioritize your own well-being, especially when the people who claim to care about you are actively working against it. I know it's frightening to stand up to family members, especially when they're telling you that resistance means you're confused or selfish or ungrateful. I know it's scary to risk being alone rather than accepting treatment that diminishes you. I know how hard it is to trust your own perceptions when people you love are telling you that your reality isn't real. But I'm here to tell you that the fear is worse than the actual experience of independence. I'm here to tell you that being alone by choice is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who don't respect you. I'm here to tell you that your instincts about what's best for you are probably more reliable than other people's opinions about what's best for you. The hardest part isn't making the decision to put yourself first. It's living with the guilt afterward, the nagging voice that tells you maybe you overreacted. Maybe they really were just trying to help. Maybe you threw away something precious over a misunderstanding. But when you're sitting on your own balcony, watching the sunset over a view you chose because it gives you joy, surrounded by people who care about you without trying to control you, the guilt fades into gratitude. Gratitude for your own courage. Gratitude for the life you've built. Gratitude for the wisdom to recognize that not all love is worth accepting. Have you ever felt pressured by family to make decisions that didn't feel right to you? Have you ever had someone tell you they knew better than you did what was good for your own life? Tell me about it in the comments. Share your story, your struggles, your victories. Let's create a community of people who understand that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And if this story gave you hope, if it reminded you of your own strength, if it helped you feel less alone in your struggles, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's make sure this message reaches everyone who needs to hear it. Everyone who needs permission to write their own version of not on the documents that would diminish their lives. Because you are worth fighting for. Your happiness is worth protecting. Your life is worth living on your own terms. And it's never, ever too late to start.